Not everyone is lucky enough to have a mentor or someone older and wiser guiding them through the unspoken rules of the workplace. Most of us just have to learn the hard way. But I'm on a mission to change that, and this podcast is that mission. Welcome to Season 2 of How to Survive Your Boss, where each episode brings real stories and practical advice from incredible professionals who've lived it. I'm Kiana, your host. Let's get into it. Welcome back to How to Survive Your Boss. Today we have a super exciting guest, Lisa. Lisa is joining us from Colorado. She is an amazing lawyer, mother, golfer, even though she won't admit it. But apparently she's a better tennis player, right? And she has lived quite an extensive legal career, I would say. So she's dabbled in litigation. She's done in-house counsel. She even owns her own private business today. So she has girl bossed all the way to the top. And today we're going to talk a little bit about her expertise in mediation, because we want to learn how to survive the workplace, how to survive your boss. And a lot of times conflict comes up at work. And the question is, how the heck do you get through that? So Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I've got a lot of questions for you. I'm ready. So many big ideas. I think the biggest thing here is, I don't know, some smart people, they like to say, play it safe, keep a low profile, don't say anything, right? And sometimes that might be true, but we're here to try to figure out if there's another way, if you can push back, if you can have a little bit more conflict in the workplace, and how to tackle that. So my first question, just to get the basics covered, is what does a mediator do as a form of law?
Okay. Well, technically, actually, mediation is not a form of the practice of law because some mediators are not lawyers. But mediation as practiced by lawyers actually differs in some significant ways from mediation as not practiced by lawyers, because we can provide information and evaluation about the legal issues in a conflict and how they might turn out if somebody decided to sue. And mediators who are not lawyers cannot do that. But either kind of mediator, their role is to assist parties in conflict in resolving their dispute. Now, sometimes the parties in a conflict, like in a lawsuit, are not going to have anything to do with each other going forward. So it's kind of a one-off. But other times, people, for example, who work together or who are married to each other have ongoing relationships. So the mediator can help them talk through the issues that are creating conflict, get the issues out on the table, talk about what are the possible ways to resolve it, and help the parties have a constructive discussion about how they want to address their conflict and what agreements about how they're going to work together in the future they might want to make. So that's the role of a mediator in helping people navigate workplace conflict. But it's not the only form of conflict resolution for people in the workplace.
But it's kind of like a gold standard, I'd almost say. Like, this is like maybe you have less official versions of handling conflict at work, and this would maybe be the most official.
It's a more formal process, but I would be remiss not to mention that there's been increasing use of ombuds in the workplace. And ombuds are neutral parties who can be called by employees who are having conflict at work. And it's almost like conflict coaching. And they can talk through with the employee what are the possible avenues for resolving this conflict. And sometimes they may suggest mediation and help arrange it. But it initially starts as a one-way or as a conversation between one of the parties to the conflict and the ombuds. So Those are
Are you
both
saying ombuds? Sorry, I just want to make sure.
ombuds. OMBUDS. Used to be called ombudsman, but since there are plenty of women ombuds, it's now called ombuds. And so that's the other common method. And I will say, normally workplaces, they might have an ombuds on staff or outsourced who remains available on a ready basis for employees, but mediators are somebody who's brought in for a specific conflict or situation.
It's fascinating. And it is humans though. Like the ombuds would be maybe the less formal, like not a lawyer mediator.
Well, they're different from mediators because they're not helping two parties negotiate. They're helping one party navigate. But you often do have lawyers who pivot into being an ombuds. But just like it's not required for a lawyer mediator to be a lawyer, it's not required for an ombuds to be a lawyer either.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I've not come across, I mean, I've not worked forever, for sure. I need more experience, but I've yet to come past mediation in the workplace, like officially. So I've seen lots of conflict.
Have you ever seen it, and you've never run across an ombuds office?
No, I would say, and part of that might be because I've worked in tech, and tech maybe has less of the formal, like startup mode. They don't have as many of those formality things, maybe. I don't know, but I've never even heard the term ombuds.
Well, that is interesting, but I think larger companies tend to have ombuds services, and many companies do have EAPs, which is another alternative employee assistance programs where people can contact them and arrange for counseling. And sometimes it's interesting how a mediator can be brought into a workplace. Sometimes it's if there is a lawsuit that is pending. Sometimes it is if there is somebody, let's say, who works for an EAP or who works in the ombuds office or who maybe works in HR and sees that there's a situation that could benefit from mediation, they tend to be the people who bring in a mediator to help with the situation.
So in general, if like a company has an EAP program or ombuds available to any regard, it's kind of a green flag. Would you say like that the company cares about dispute resolution, or when do you think it's an appropriate time for a company to implement those tactics?
Well, I think it shows that the company is concerned about managing conflict in the workplace and helping employees navigate challenges in the workplace in a constructive way. So it could be that those are the same companies, that might be more receptive to mediation. I've also seen situations, though, where you have management show some self-awareness that they may have somehow contributed to the development of conflict in the workplace. And it could be that you have the manager has created a situation where there's conflict between people who work together and they don't know how to navigate their way out of it. So, of course, they could look for coaching or guidance for HR, but they are often likely to label it as a problem between the peers rather than a management problem, and therefore decide that that's a good time to bring in a mediator. So I've had several instances where I've been brought in as a mediator and then had the challenge where, yes, there's conflict between these two colleagues, but it's part of a larger problem in the workplace, and
like
then a system, and then have to think about it end up almost being the mediator between those employees and their management in terms of presenting my findings that they've been afraid to present to their management in the first place.
How do you define work conflict? Like, what does that look like specifically to you?
Well, conflict takes many forms teams. It can be
Right.
conflicts between individuals. It can be actually often it's conflicts between departments. And actually, one of my sons and I did a presentation at the Association for Conflict Resolution focused on resolving conflicts between departments or teams. And so some of the factors that lead to conflict between teams are the same as those that lead to conflict between individuals, and sometimes they're different.
It's interesting. I wonder, in the situation where conflict is at like a department level, do you come in, I guess the person who hires you, is it like one of the department that wants help to communicate this? Is it the board that's maybe wondering why these parties can't produce results? How does it come up to where, hey, let me give Lisa a call?
Either could be HR or it could be a manager who's responsible for supervising both departments and is seeing them not cooperate and does not know, number one, what they might have done to create tension between the departments, and two, it could be that they don't understand or they're misdiagnosing what the source of the conflict is, and so they want to bring out in an outside party to facilitate a conflict resolution process. And when you're brought in those situations, you do a certain amount of due diligence first in speaking with, perhaps in that situation, the person who manages the two departments and the head of the two departments. And I like to go into those situations with an open mind about structuring a conflict resolution process. Like, what is it going to look like? Who is going to be invited to participate? Do I need to start with some subgroup, or do I need to have some kind of meeting with everybody from both departments? Or, how do we do this? And if I see that management is contributing to the conflict, how would it be possible to have them involved, in the conflict resolution process? And often they don't want to be, because they don't want, even if privately they might be willing to accept some responsibility, they don't want to be seen as accepting some responsibility.
That makes sense. In similar fashion to how you have to scream to the towers of the good things you do, you also want to hide the things that aren't so favorable, I guess. So it would make sense to, avoid.
He wants to save face.
Yeah.
It's a human thing.
Well, so to double tap into just work conflict in general, because I think that's such an everyday occurrence for a lot of people.
Oh, yes.
An everyday occurrence, and I think for most of us, at least myself, I know I've never gone through any formal discussion of how to approach a conflict at work. You kind of just are given relationship skills through life that you try to apply in workplace and personal instances, and then you, by trial and error, find that certain things work in some places than not. Is there, I guess if we were to start with, we've got a work conflict, I have one, let's say, hypothetically. What's the first thing you would tell me to start looking at? Or are there any characteristics I should start with trying to assess my situation?
I think as somebody who goes in and tries to understand what's going on, I do try to understand certain, which buckets the conflict might fall into. Like, is this an interpersonal conflict between two people who don't get along? Or is this sometimes you have conflict because one person wants to follow the rules, or one person is performing and another person may not be performing. There could be confusion about roles and responsibilities. There could be competing interests in being promoted. I mean, there are certain situations that tend to generate conflict. For example, when somebody is hired as a lateral manager, that tends to lead to conflict. Why? Because you might have other people within the workplace who applied for that position and were disappointed that they didn't get it. You may have the situation where somebody who is hired laterally is actually brought in to effectuate change. People don't like change. So the mere prospect of change can make people feel anxious. Okay. And so they may not be cooperating with the new management. So, and conflict can arise between peers. It can arise in a hierarchical situation. So there are lots of variables, but those are some of the things that I think about. Often when you do your due diligence on what the conflict is, you're going to hear different stories from everybody, right? The manager will have their story. The people who are, let's say you have two departments who don't get along. The manager has their narrative. Each department has their narrative. Each department has their own incentive systems. Often the incentives are clashing. And so I think from an individual perspective, I actually think mediation training is fantastic for everybody, even if they're not going to be a mediator, because it helps you look at situations in kind of an objective perspective. And also understand that each situation can have multiple viewpoints, and you get sort of trained to see the situation from the perspective of everybody who's involved. And so I think often whether it's a manager or an employee or two employees having conflict, or even two teams or departments having conflict, part of the issue is they haven't thought about what is the other side's perspective. What are their interests here? What are they trying to accomplish? And so being able to take a step back and having like a more holistic understanding of the situation, I think is like a great first step in thinking about how to navigate it.
Did you have like a specific example of like how you resolved like a work conflict, like either between people or the departments, and like what ultimately like came out of it? Like because I know you're like, it could be people between people, but how does that get resolved? Because I feel like,
well,
I would have so much resentment. I wouldn't want to resolve it.
She's saying she has a lot of enemies.
Right.
You've identified something that is a very significant barrier to conflict resolution, which is that people tend to want to hold on to their conflict and to their perspective. However, there are tools that a mediator has in helping people think about situations from the other person's point of view and coming into the situation with some empathy and looking at things in a way that they might not have. Just to give you an example, I was brought into private medical practice where it was explained to me that 3 people on a team were not getting along. And it was interesting because all 3 of them were from 3 different countries with 3 different cultures. So I met with them, and in having discussions, it turned out that their conflict, or the manifestation of conflict between them, was a result of the fact that their team was experiencing a couple of different kinds of challenges. One was that another team that they were relying on was not doing their job properly. So conflict was arising between them about how to make up this deficit. So one person was kind of more of a driver and was getting angry at one of her teammates for not doing a job that wasn't hers to begin with. And so once we were able to kind of identify this common problem that they had, then I was able to facilitate a discussion among them about, given that this is really what is causing the problem, how can the three of you work together within the confines of this organization to try to get the challenge you're experiencing with this other team addressed? And I cannot describe for you how the entire dynamic between these three people changed. And they also kind of agreed, like, there was a certain amount prior to this of like, one person was being excluded from a lunch or, something like this. And part of this was like kind of this manifestation
Catty.
of this conflict. But they also, I said, and how can we keep good relationships between you? And now that you have shared what your challenges are and that you're each taking on your own some approach to addressing it rather than working together to address it. I think they agreed they'd have lunch together every week or something like that. But they also discussed how they were going to present this challenge they had with the other team. We discussed who should it be presented to. Did they have any ideas for how this challenge could be addressed? I think they felt that because they were kind of a team that was on the lower end of the totem pole, that nobody was taking their concerns seriously. And how could they present their concerns in a constructive and professional way to get people to address it? They also explained to me, and this was something that I reported back, I think I was brought in by the office manager. And of course, the narrative was these people were assisting doctors, and the doctors were complaining about the tension among the three of them. And they said, well, actually, this is the atmosphere in the entire practice. This is how everybody speaks to each other. So I'm sure they never could say it. But number one, I think I was helpful to them in addressing the immediate cause of the challenges that they were experiencing. But I also took it upon myself to share with the office manager or practice manager what was shared with me, that I understood that there was a lot of cursing or name calling among the medical staff, and that it was really important for them to model the kind of behavior that they wanted to see on the part of the people who worked for them. Now, I did offer, and this is something that I think can be helpful, I've done this for companies, some training on respectful communication in the workplace, and it's helpful to sort of establish common expectations for how conflicts are going to be addressed, and also just the level of civility that everybody can expect.
Yeah.
And they didn't take me up on that. And again, I think part of this was she worked for the medical staff, so that she thought it was a challenge to present to them that they needed any training in communication or supervision. Yeah. But I do think I really helped that department, identify and come up with a plan to address their conflicts. They also agreed. They agreed on things like, if you have a problem with how your colleague is handling a situation, you won't criticize her in public. You'll speak to her separately. Things like this to try to prevent the conflict from recurring. I think that was you can't solve all the problems, but I think I really made a difference for that particular department.
No, that's a fantastic example. That definitely helps me see the process you're referring to, where it's kind of like you come in, you take roll and diagnose the situation, talk to all the stakeholders, but you probably also talk to like other business players in the company, because how else would you figure out all the other systems around them?
Well, sometimes you do and sometimes you don't talk to other people. It really depends on the scope of the engagement. But in this situation, and you do meet with people separately and together so that they can, and often you meet with them separately initially so they can share their perspective without, concern about the other people hearing it. But once you're in the process and you can encourage them to share their perspective and their experience. I felt embarrassed when you criticized me for not doing this other team's job. And they also had some structural issues because it was a department, I think they had 3. The person with the greatest amount of experience and expertise had not been appointed as any kind of manager because she was the one who was really a driver. So she was really great at doing her job, not so great with her communication skills. So nobody was in a position to tell anybody else what to do. So, that was another challenge.
Yeah.
Because she kind of felt like she was the leader, but nobody had designated her as the leader.
I see. So it's like all the extra work with no pay and like missing a gap in a sense of like,
so it
cohesivity.
Was unclear roles and responsibilities because I think people kind of expected her to act like a leader, but on the other hand, her colleagues did not report to her. So that was also the source of tension.
Those are.
But go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just
you
gonna
go.
say I've had these instances in my career where I've been given one direction that might be contradictory to another team's direction, or it might be contradictory to, I don't know, like one, let's say, project that we're working on, like do it this way, but this one project we do the exact opposite, and it gets really confusing. And I think it forms an interesting, I guess, like segue into the idea that the direction and kind of information you receive from leadership and the structure that around you can really either help with conflict avoidance or increase like conflict creation on a regular basis. Because if you don't have direction, right, then you're going to fight more.
And conflict is going to arise. So it's not about avoiding conflict entirely. It's about having constructive ways to be able to resolve it. So if you're perceiving conflict between the directions you were given on one project and the directions you're given on another project, do you know how to get this resolved? Do you know how to bring this up? Will it be accepted? I mean, again, a lot of that depends on the culture of the organization. I mean, some are more authoritarian and where the managers are less receptive to that. But, I think that mediation can be, helpful in addressing a particular situation. But I also think capacity building, training, and coaching can be helpful to empower people to do their jobs better.
Right. And I was wondering, because you had said it before that you can't fix all problems. Has there, what happens? What happens if you can't fix the problem? What do they do? They just, or...
Yeah, have you had like an impossible case that you just couldn't, there was nothing you could do and you were like, you guys are a lost cause, I'm out of here?
Well, I try to do what I can, but sometimes like this example I gave you. Do I think it's a problem that the medical staff does not speak respectfully to their assistants?
Right.
Yes. And I suggested including them in a mediation process. I suggested, they could benefit from coaching. I suggested maybe having a session on respectful communication in the workplace to kind of establish common expectations. All of this with the idea of trying to help people save face. But no, I wasn't successful, in at least to my knowledge, in addressing that. And, I think there's advantages when you work within an organization, let's say in HR or something like that, where you can see, and actually, I think that's sort of the role of an ombuds because they're consulted confidentially by employees and they don't repeat the specific complaints. But if they see a pattern emerging, like they're hearing from a lot of the employees, let's say, who report to a particular manager, or like in the situation I was discussing, if they heard a lot of complaints about how the medical staff was treating everybody who worked for them, the medical assistants, the nurses, the PAs, whatever, that is something they could report to management without identifying the specific people who were complaining. So the advantage of an ombud service is that they are, and actually I had for a long time a client which was an EAP, and they did some of the same thing, that they would see patterns in the kind of issues that they were being consulted about and address them on a more systemic basis with the client company.
Yeah. There's this slightly, I don't know, maybe misguided saying in business, I think, or in corporate coaching, because I've had a handful of coaches where they're always like, if something goes wrong, like look at yourself because you're the only thing you can control. And your responses, which like totally reasonable. Yes, like I can only control how I respond in a situation, all these things. But when it comes to actually figuring out what went wrong and, the issues, I used to always say, you would think in a business you'd start looking at the system first, and then you start to point like outcomes to individuals and responses by individuals. But, for example, if a company doesn't have a really strong target process, like this is the goals that you're supposed to hit, this is how much money you're supposed to sell, or, whatever it is, if they're not very clear on that, and then, there's conflict between a manager and an employee of, what counts for commission or what doesn't count for commission, I can look at myself as the employee and say, okay, I need to respond respectfully, as you've mentioned. But I also, like, my response is a mechanism of a lacking of a system or like a guardrail.
Well, sometimes I think you're right that the problem is with the system, that there aren't clear roles and responsibilities, or incentives are not aligned. But I guess I would it is true one should look at oneself, because if your efforts to deal with that situation have resulted in conflict instead of a solution, then it is true that to try to obtain a solution, you have to try something else because what you tried did not work. I would also say that there is definitely conflict in the workplace that's due to toxic personalities or toxic cultures. And really, I think one of the other things that employees should ask themselves when they find themselves in conflict is this a situation that I can realistically do anything about? And if not, I often ask people, because usually people call a lawyer, I want to sue. It's not illegal to be a jerk. It's just not. Not unless you're discriminating and only being a jerk to a particular group of people. But being a jerk across the board, generally not, not illegal.
I've had a lawyer tell me those exact words.
So then you have to think, like, what are my options? And sometimes, usually, well, a lot of times what you want to do is separate the problem from the people. So you don't want to say you're a bad manager. That's not
it's not a good
diplomatic.
Start.
But you can say, I'm confused about what our priorities are. Could you provide me guidance? And if you present it as a request for assistance or guidance, then usually people like to be helpful to other people, then people will try to do that. On the other hand, if it's that the boss is a jerk, everybody around him is a jerk, he's elevated people who are just like him, you don't want to be like them, then you need to think about maybe making a move and just surviving the situation as it is. I actually was consulted by somebody who used to have their own business, and I was her lawyer, and then went in-house to do a similar function, and found her, even though she was doing a fantastic job and had gotten a lot of recognition, she was working for somebody with a terrible temper. And we talked about what are her options. To some extent, it's helpful to understand, not to take it personally, because if you've seen that person behave that way to many people, you know it's not your fault. And the most practical solution is looking for another place to work and just trying to do your best in your job and lay low. I mean, that's the situation where the laying low is the right situation, because you don't think it's really possible to improve the situation.
Yeah. You can't change another person's personality. Can't make.
You absolutely cannot. Sometimes, though, people do not realize that there are things that they might be doing that are annoying to other people. And okay, I mean, I had a situation where it was in a school context, but a new head of department was hired, and that person had an executive assistant, and the newly hired manager had a habit of cursing a lot, not at the person, just that was the language that he tended to use. And she found it made her really uncomfortable. And then she kind of responded by not being very helpful and supportive in her role as his assistant, and things kind of spiraled, from there. But I think what was a very successful mediation with them, where we got the issues on the table, and he agreed that he would refrain from profanity. And, they both were interested in the success of this department. And so they discussed the ways in which he felt she wasn't supporting him or was undermining him. And they agreed to change the ways they worked together. I think that was, but you have to be receptive to hearing things in order for it to work.
Yeah, I took a class in college. We did like a 1-week session on how to give and receive feedback, because there are like certain things that we never learn as a part of basic adult social culture. Giving feedback is one of them.
Yes.
Receiving feedback is another one. And when this 1 week of class stuck with me quite literally throughout my whole career, and came up so many times because, I would receive unsolicited feedback, or a leader in a company I'm at would like casually make a comment, or I would make a casual comment to my employees. And I didn't, to your point, like there's certain things I had to learn the hard way of, calling someone out in front of other people. Hey, I've done this before, unintentionally, just like asking a question to our team group, like, hey, who did this? Like trying to figure this thing out type thing. And in response, I got a very upset employee thinking I was like trying to embarrass them or like all these things. I
exactly
truly had no like purview that that's what I was doing. And I felt really bad afterwards, and I was shocked. And it didn't come up because she deliberately brought it to me. It was just, I could feel like tension in our relationship after a couple meetings, and her really, let's say, aggressive response, like very defensive response when I was messaging. And when I was talking about it later, she was like, well, you brought this up with everyone. I was like, I just didn't know who did it. But I do acknowledge, like, I definitely should have handled this. I didn't, you know what I mean? Like, I just didn't realize that at all. Now I'm on the other side of it.
Yeah, actually, there's a fantastic book called Thanks for the Feedback. I don't remember the author's name right now, but he or she, there's different kinds of feedback that need to be given in the workplace. It could be, feedback on a particular project, feedback about how you're doing as an employee. And there's at least one other kind. And one of the points they make is each of these kinds of feedback needs to be presented differently, number one. And number two, that you should explain to the employee something like, I'm having a problem with this project. And that might have been a better way to present it to your team. Like, I'm having a problem with this project. I'm not quite sure why this was done, and I'd like to be able to correct it. And if you have any information that would be helpful to me in addressing this, I'd appreciate your getting back to me. Something so the person wouldn't take it personally, right? So you have to give people like a graceful exit. That's like one of my favorite lines. Like, people want to be able to save face. And so, one, if you can explain why you're presenting the feedback, and two, presenting it in a way that allows people to save some face. But on the other hand, if you're giving feedback, for example, in the context of an employee improvement plan or something like that, you do want to be kind and diplomatic, but you also have to be direct and specific, because the function of that feedback is to help that person improve their overall performance. But if you can explain why you're giving the feedback, and it's always really important in situations to identify the common interest that you have with the person that you're speaking to. So you were having a problem completing a project or a process or something like that. Everybody in your department shares that goal of getting that done properly. So, tying things to the common interest, or if you're doing an employee improvement plan, you could say, I know you want to succeed, and I really want you to succeed. So I'm giving you this feedback to assist you in improving your performance.
I could have done so much better, Lisa. You have no idea. I think of some of the mistakes I made early on as a manager, and I'm like, you're an idiot.
I've had a career for how many years now? A lot of years. And I've certainly learned from my own mistakes. And I actually apply a lot of what I've learned in other contexts, like on the tennis court, the golf course, but especially like if you have a partner in tennis, thinking about how you can make suggestions about how the team can play together better, rather than throwing people under the bus.
You're too slow, Lance. Run faster.
He's not my he doesn't play tennis right now. So, but it is very hard, by the way, in either bridge or tennis, for married couples to be partners, because there's so much, they're so sensitive about giving and receiving feedback from each other.
A personal question that comes to mind, and I'm genuinely curious if you've seen a trend in your career and all the mediations you handled, but have you seen a trend where women have, I don't know what the right term is, almost like less leeway before conflict arises in other sectors?
100%.
I knew
and
it.
There's a book on this called Women Don't Ask. And then there's a follow-up book called Ask for It. So there is definitely a lot of evidence in multiple contexts, including universities, among like student evaluations of professors, that women have a much narrower kind
Wiggle
of
room.
channel that they can operate in. On one hand, they don't want to be seen as pushovers or timid. And on the other hand, they don't want to be seen as overly bossy. And, men can often behave in ways that
Women cannot.
Absolutely cannot. And there definitely is a double standard. And that's actually one of the reasons for having workplace-wide training on things like communication skills and conflict resolution, is to kind of establish an across-the-board standard about what is appropriate.
That's like most validating sentence you could have said, or response you could have said, Lisa, because I have this conversation almost weekly with like other women leaders, and we just talk about how certain things I've said in my career were very like, maybe, yes, I got a little too comfortable in a space, or a little too comfortable with an employee having too much trust and not remembering formal boundaries because of a mechanism of the culture in the company or whatever. But certain things I have said that have gotten certain responses, I'm like, what? And then I wonder, because I've had male, superiors and so forth that have said some wild things in comparison to the soft words I've barely used.
I 100%. It is there's no question about it. And there's so much evidence. I don't know whether you've you know about the glass ceiling, but there's also, I think it's called the glass cliff, that you know, when a company is in trouble, that's when women get promoted to leadership because men don't want to take the chance on failing. But it's just interesting. But I do think, and this may not be politically correct, who knows, that men and women have certain there are certain innate differences, and some of it could be cultural, in how men and women communicate and understand situations and resolve conflict. And there's also evidence that women can be better negotiators if they're negotiating on behalf of somebody else, because that's acceptable. Negotiating on behalf of yourself is much less acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mama bear.
Right. But I think the other part of that is that we should lean into and I wasn't a big fan of Lean In the book, but lean into our strengths and cultivate them. And therefore, knowing that about the workplace, try to figure out, you know, what the challenges are in a situation and how best to approach them.
That's crazy. This is very helpful. Also, just give me a lot to think about in terms of, you know, how to approach conflict before it's conflict, maybe. Like maybe there are early telltale signs before something arises to conflict. And maybe you can shed some light on this, Lisa, is just how I'm trying to think of my experiences with workplace conflict. A lot of times it came at the hand of another person kind of pinning us against each other, putting us in a position where, you know, like you said, conflicting targets that or incentives that kind of have us operating or competing against each other within a company. And I'm wondering how, you know, if you have a conflict with your boss, how do you address it? Do you address it? Is it
well, again, it depends what it is, because if it could be positioned not so much as conflict, but as a challenge, like I'm having a challenge because I have received a number of assignments which seem to all be due at the same time, and I don't think I have the resources to accomplish them, and I know it's important to you to have them accomplished, and it's important to me to get them accomplished, but I want your advice or guidance, or maybe you have suggestions as to other resources that might be available to me. So positioning things as not so much a conflict, but a common challenge.
They say it.
It's, you know, can be better than knowing you're having a conflict because this person does not want to give you credit for anything you've done. You have a personal glass ceiling, and, you know, in that kind of situation, the only way to get it addressed, but it's often not successful, is bringing in a third person who might have some influence over the situation, like HR or the legal department. But
that
being
could hurt.
Yeah, that can definitely backfire.
Yeah. Which, I mean, it's like you can understand it.
Yes,
Right.
I absolutely can. But, you know, people also hire executive coaches on their own to talk through, you know, or an ombuds, because it is confidential. You could call them and discuss how, you know, because HR reports to management and they're always on the management side, but the ombuds is like more of a neutral.
Lisa, we were just talking. I was telling Tara, I was like, we're you know, the episode's kind of, I got to wrap it up here in a sec.
Okay.
So, but I was telling her we both have so many questions. I'm like, I have more questions than before this session, because now I'm like, you know what? This is really fascinating to me because everybody in the world deals with this. And it's kind of crazy that nowhere in workplace trainings, in personal life, in schooling, no one teaches you how to handle conflict. It's like only if your parents are good at it type.
And ours are
Nugget of
not.
Right. Right. Sorry.
Well, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, as you know.
Yeah.
I started out being a litigator and decided this is not a good use of time, money, human energy. And a lot of times I could see that, the problem could have been avoided or the people could have resolved it in a better way. And that's kind of what I've devoted my career to, is helping people find a better way to manage conflict, teaching law students, how to do that, how to manage their relationships with their clients and with other lawyers, and really have constructive engagement, because that's really the goal.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, too, with today's, I think, current employment environment and the layoffs and the high anxiety, and I feel like people are more on edge than usual. Just economy, like everything's got everybody a little bit anxious. And
I'm sure that is true.
Right? And I think a lot of conflict starts from the emotional aspect of it and not reeling it back. And I say that as someone who has worked in certain situations where I've been manipulated. I've had my triggers kind of used against me to create these illicit emotional responses in the workplace. Like, for example, growing up, I kind of used to get shit on a lot. Very critical family, we could say, least part, right? And then I found myself in the workplace and, certain it's not feedback, but like certain criticism can really shut me down almost. Like, I don't want to participate in the conversation anymore. And I've had instances where that knowledge of that, like seeing me doing that, has been used against me. And like, I've had people try to trigger that emotion. And then I, of course, respond emotionally, because in the moment when it happens, I'm like not thinking clearly. I'm just upset or, whatever it is. And then I react. And then all of a sudden I'm aggressive, or, I am whatever they call it, like a mean boss or a bad coworker, and as a woman, I think because we're already predisposed or expected to be too emotional to do our job because of our hormones or whatever it is that the fake stereotypes try to put against us. Like, I think that it leaned more into this narrative where someone could paint a picture of me being crazy because a couple of emotional responses. So respectful communication is maybe what we should talk about next time.
Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation. And there's so much to be said on the topic. And I would say this on the topic you raised. Daniel Goleman, who wrote the book about emotional intelligence, also wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence at Work. And there's a lot of good books on managing conflict in the workplace. But generally, as humans, our natural response is fight, flight, or freeze. And, I don't do it all the time, but it's useful to think about, how am I going to respond rather than react? And even getting in the habit of saying something like, I want to give some thought to what you've said. I'll get back to you on that. And buying yourself some time to calm down and think about the situation.
Yeah.
And think about how, think about it from their perspective. And I'm sure, and I know we don't have time to get into this, your perception is that they were intentionally triggering you, but it also could be that they just have certain patterns of communication that happen to trigger you. There could be cultural differences in what you think is acceptable versus what they think is acceptable. So getting in the habit of sort of taking that step back and maybe giving the other person the benefit of the doubt and trying to understand the situation from their perspective can be very helpful.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we covered a lot today. Just to give a quick little recap, I think, of some key points, and Lisa, keep me honest here, but I think the biggest one is mediation is more of a process. It's not a, quick fix button or somebody comes in and just does a job. It's truly a process. That includes not only factoring multiple variables, such as the hierarchy in a company, the culture in a company, what systems exist, what are the cultures of the individuals, but also a little bit more of just people knowledge, maybe understanding, how people are communicating and what is going on with just the day-to-day little things that are maybe causing this larger conflict, but, aren't directly related to each other, so they don't see that blind spot. And then I think when it comes to conflict with your boss, biggest thing is to figure out, do I have any room to change this? Can I make an impact? If I can't make an impact, maybe it's time to just close the door, start looking for a new job and being, smart about it, protecting yourself. And then we kind of dove into a couple sidebar topics of, women having, let's say, the cards against us a little bit in the conflict world. And then wrapping it up with just all things tied to, respectful communication and specific examples of how you can avoid conflict, I think, before it turns into like a larger situation. Anything else, Lisa?
I would just say avoiding conflict is not a good thing because issues tend to just fester and percolate. It's maybe anticipating conflict or maybe repositioning conflict as challenge and
how you say it and how you
working with the other person in the situation to try to navigate it together.
Absolutely. Well, Lisa, I can't wait to have you back because me and Tara are going to start working on questions. And now, next time, I'm going to come prepared with specific examples of conflicts and what you think you would do, because this is I have seen some crazy stuff go down in workplaces. So I'd love to get your opinion on it. But other than that, Lisa, is there any shout outs? I know Lisa has her own business, so if anybody needs a mediator, she is obviously the best. But is there anything else to plug?
Well, the only other thing that I would say, and I think you're on the mailing list, is I do publish a monthly newsletter and where I discuss both legal and conflict resolution topics. And it's started out as a marketing vehicle, and it really is just a labor of love where I, for example, will have several mediations in a row where like a common problem in the process has emerged, and I'll use the newsletter as an opportunity to talk about it. So if you visit my website, which is lisapom.com, you can see the newsletter and subscribe if you're interested.
It's a business. Lisa Pomerantz, you have been an absolute pleasure. You have educated me quite a lot today. I didn't think it would be, I knew it was going to be an interesting conversation, but I guess I didn't think there was so much to it and so much to consider. And now I'm I need to go a layer deeper. So we will talk soon. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, please check out lisapom.com. She is thebomb.com.
Oh, well, thank you.
Peace and love, everybody.
Peace and love.